Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another sutta study session here at Empty Cloud Monastery. So hello to some friends checking in. Hello, Kauser friend, Michael. Happy to hear this is your new favorite sutta. Hello, Sarah and Robin. And to whoever else is watching, welcome. So as usual, I'll read through this sutta and give some explanations. And then at the end, I'll answer any questions which have come up. So please feel free to type in questions at any time, and I'll get to them at the end. And hello as well to Liz and Musin from Indonesia. Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So today we'll be looking at Anguttara Nikaya chapter of the Fives, sutta number 162. Aghata Pativinaya Sutta, which is translated here as removing resentment. The sutta here is given by Venerable Sariputta. So as I spoke about last time, Venerable Sariputta gave many teachings and was considered second only to the Buddha in terms of his ability to give wisdom teachings. So the second most common speaker of suttas is Venerable Sariputta, so after the Buddha. So this is one of Venerable Sariputta's suttas. And I've noticed that I tend to very frequently select suttas by Venerable Sariputta, not on purpose, but just because I always seem to really like Sariputta suttas. There's something about them that really works for my attitude towards Dhamma. And this is one of those suttas where when I read it, it made a very strong impact on my own practice. And it's a sutta that I very commonly bring to mind. And that's because I'm a hate type and I'm prone to hating things and hating situations and hating people. So anything from the suttas which gives practical advice for how to deal with aversive mind states towards other people is something which I really appreciate because it's targeting one of my own main working spots, which I've had to deal with over the years. So this particular sutta begins with Venerable Sariputta speaking. So the sutta says, Venerable Sariputta addressed the monks. Venerable monks. Venerable, those monks replied to Venerable Sariputta. Minor point, by the way, so as has been pointed out by Bhante Analayo, the term bhikkhave, which is the plural vocative form of bhikkhu, is used in the suttas in a gender-neutral way. So whenever you see the word monks, that's not referring just to males, but it's referring to people of any gender. So it says, Venerable Sariputta said this, Venerables, there are 5 occasions for removing resentment where a monk should completely remove arisen resentment. What 5? Here, Venerables, some person is not completely pure in their physical conduct, but they are completely pure in their verbal conduct. One should remove one's resentment towards such a person. Here, Venerables, some person is not completely pure in their verbal conduct, but they are completely pure in their physical conduct. One should also remove one's resentment towards such a person. Here, Venerables, some person is not completely pure in their physical conduct or their verbal conduct, but they occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind. One should also remove one's resentment towards such a person. Here, Venerables, some person is not completely pure in their physical conduct or their verbal conduct, and they do not occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind. One should also remove one's resentment towards such a person. Here, venerables, some person is completely pure in their physical conduct and their verbal conduct, and they occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind. One should also remove one's resentment towards such a person. So these are the 5 kinds of people, or the 5 situations of relating to a person, which the sutta is going to go through. So it's ranked in terms of 3 characteristics. One is the person's physical conduct. The second is their verbal conduct. And the third is the openness and clarity of their mind. So these 3 ways of evaluating someone, 3 ways that we might relate to someone. So for example, somebody might speak harshly and rudely or improperly. So that would be a lack of purity in verbal conduct. They might do things which are inappropriate. So maybe they make a lot of noise when they move around, or they break dishes in the kitchen, or they maybe even do really significant things like breaking precepts. So it would be physical misconduct, not being pure in physical conduct. And then the issue of openness of mind and clarity of mind is referring to the development of meditation practice in particular, but more generally to the development of the mind, the development of higher spiritual qualities of mind. So these are 3 ways in which if we observe somebody's physical conduct is not so great, or their verbal conduct is not so great, or we think that their mind is not sufficiently spiritual, then these are all reasons where we might produce resentment, aversion, or negativity towards that person. And this is particularly true when we're dealing with people who we expect to be up to a certain standard, and then we find out that they're not. So this often comes up in monasteries, especially when people are fairly new to Buddhism. They sometimes think that all monks are perfect enlightened beings. And then they come to visit a monastery and they discover within a fairly short period of time that most of us are not enlightened, and we still have quite a bit of work left to do. And that broken dream can lead to a lot of resentment arising. But it can come up in any context where you have to deal with another person, and it can even come up in relating to yourself. So it should be noted, though, that although the sutta seems to mostly be taken as referring to how to deal with other people, it can also have to do with how we relate to ourselves. So if we're experiencing a lot of negativity or aversion towards ourselves, then we can still apply the methods that Venerable Sariputta gives in this discourse. So now I'll go ahead and read through each of these 5 scenarios. So Sariputta says, Venerables, in the case of a person who is not completely pure in their physical conduct, but who is completely pure in their verbal conduct, how should one remove one's resentment towards that person? Venerables, it is like a monk who sees a torn rag on the road. They hold it down with their left foot, spread it out with their right foot, cut out the best part, pick it up, and depart. In the same way, Venerables, when a person is not completely pure in their physical conduct, but is completely pure in their verbal conduct, then on that occasion one should not pay attention to the lack of complete purity in their physical conduct, but rather one should pay attention to the complete purity in their verbal conduct. This is how one should remove resentment towards that person. So this simile, keep in mind this is coming from a time when cloth, and especially good quality cloth, was quite expensive. So most people had very little clothing. just the bare minimum to get by. And to get new clothing was quite a significant expense. And the monks at that time, as we find, especially in the Vinaya, the monks often had a very hard time getting enough cloth to make robes with. So one of the common practices was anytime one saw a rag, a piece of discarded cloth, then one would try to make use of it. It was something which was valuable and useful and hard to come by. So if you came across a rag, these days, if you see a rag lying discarded by the side of the road, you just ignore it. Or if you're feeling civic-minded, then you might pick it up and put it in the trash. But in the situation that most of the monks in the time of the Buddha were in, if you saw a rag, then you would immediately start looking. Is there anything useful here? Maybe most of this rag is useless, but maybe there's some part of it that I could cut out and use to put a patch on my robe, or maybe make a handkerchief out of it, or maybe if it's enough material, I could even make something useful, like a little bag. So there might be some benefit here. So in the same way, if you see someone who their physical conduct is not so great, so that's usually the first thing that we notice about somebody, is what they're doing physically. Then we should look a bit more closely and see, well, how about the way the person speaks? Do they ever speak kindly or gently? Do they ever say anything that's beneficial? Do they ever say anything that's wise? Do they ever speak in a way that brings benefit to other people? So you start investigating and looking to see if there's anything praiseworthy in how that person speaks. So again, as Sariputta says here, if somebody's physical conduct is not so good, but their verbal conduct is praiseworthy, then you pay attention to the praiseworthy qualities of their speech, and don't fixate on their negative qualities of physical behavior. So again, what we're trying to do here is to look for the best in other people. Rather than looking for things to complain and criticize about, we look for things to praise. We look for things to appreciate. The second example that Sariputta gives, he says, Venerables, in the case of a person who is not completely pure in their verbal conduct, but who is completely pure in their physical conduct, how should one remove one's resentment towards that person? Venerables, it is like a pond that is completely covered with algae and leaves. A person might come who is overheated, overcome by the heat, exhausted, thirsty, and dehydrated. They would plunge into that pool, sweep aside the algae and leaves with both hands, drink with cupped hands, and depart. In the same way, Venerables, when a person is not completely pure in their verbal conduct, but is completely pure in their physical conduct, then on that occasion, one should not pay attention to the lack of complete purity in their verbal conduct, but rather one should pay attention to the complete purity in their physical conduct. This is how one should remove resentment towards that person. So this is the other scenario where somebody, maybe they speak in a rough, coarse, rude way. Maybe they use a lot of profanity, or they make a lot of disgusting jokes, or they engage in a lot of idle, frivolous chatter about pop culture or whatever useless things people like to talk about. But then you look and you see, well, is this person hurting anyone? Is this person doing anything destructive or harmful with their body? Or are they doing good things? How are they acting physically? So maybe somebody speaks in a rude and harsh way, but they actually do kind and gentle things. Like maybe they wash your bowl after breakfast for you, or they help out with cleaning up after lunch, or you notice that they make donations to the homeless shelter or something along those lines. So you start to notice, well, okay, so maybe this person's not so great with restraint of the mouth. Maybe they're not so great with their verbal conduct. But physically, they're not doing any harm. And in fact, they seem to be making an effort to do good things. They're making an effort to do good deeds. So an example of this was, my mind is blanking on the details. But it was a case of somebody who was giving a gift. And while giving the gift, they actually spoke in a rather harsh and rough way, like, here, take this. But there's still the act of giving. The act of generosity was very clear. And the underlying mind state of kindness and compassion was very clear. And it was, you could tell that the person had these incredibly strong habits of speaking in a rough and harsh way. And those habits were so strong that they couldn't overcome them in that moment. But the underlying wish to do something kind for another person was still present, and there was still the act of giving. So in that case, the proper thing to do is to pay attention to the physical act of goodness, and not to get caught up in the blameworthy manner of speech that went along with it. And again, the imagery that Sariputta uses here is quite potent. So if somebody is dehydrated and overheated, they really need water, and you come across a pool, but the surface of the pool is all covered in algae and leaves. Well, normally you wouldn't want to drink that water. Normally you would look for water that was already clean and pure. But on this occasion, you know there's good water there. And you just need to sweep aside the muck on the surface, and then you'll find the good water beneath that. So it's the same when you're dealing with somebody whose verbal conduct is not so great, but physically they're actually making an effort to act like a good person. So we sweep aside the harshness or coarseness or rudeness or less praiseworthy qualities of speech and focus on the good things that they're actually doing physically. Then the third case, this is where things start to get a little more challenging. Says, Venerables, in the case of a person who is not completely pure in their physical conduct or their verbal conduct, so this is someone who can be really hard to get along with. They don't do anything particularly praiseworthy with either their body or their speech. So they say rude things, they do rude things, they behave in self-centered ways, and you're like, oh, this person is so difficult to be with, so difficult to live with, so difficult to spend time around. But Sariputta says, but who occasionally gains openness of mind and clarity of mind. So there are moments when you see that person's mind clears and there's some serenity starts to peek through. Some wisdom starts to peek through. So you can tell that although this person is having a lot of problems with physical and verbal conduct, that there's some development of mind happening. You can tell that they are starting to develop the underlying wholesome mental qualities, which may eventually culminate in wholesome physical and verbal behavior. You can see that they're developing spiritual qualities of mindfulness and serenity. You can see that they're getting at least the underlying basis, which can become loving kindness and compassion, and which can eventually ripen in wisdom. So you can appreciate that openness of mind, that clarity of mind, however minimal and temporary it might be. You can still look for it and praise it and appreciate it. So the simile he gives, he says, Venerables, it is like a puddle of water in a cow's footprint. A person might come who is overheated, overcome by the heat, exhausted, thirsty, and dehydrated. They might think, there is a puddle of water in that cow's footprint. If I drink with my cupped hands or with a cup, then I will disturb it and muddy it, which will make it undrinkable. Perhaps I will get down on all fours, drink like a cow, and depart. They get down on all fours, drink like a cow, and depart. In the same way, venerables, when a person is not completely pure in their physical conduct or their verbal conduct, but occasionally gains openness of mind and clarity of mind, then one should not pay attention to either their lack of complete purity in physical conduct or their lack of complete purity in their verbal conduct. Instead, one should pay attention to the fact that they occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind. This is how one should remove resentment towards that person. So, of all the similes that he gives, this is the one which has always had the strongest impact on me. So this is when you meet someone and you're just like, wow, I really can't handle how this person acts. But nonetheless, you can see that there is some spark of spiritual motivation within them. There is some motivation towards self-development, self-improvement. There is some tendency to at least occasionally have some light of goodness shining through their mind. So again, this is the case where there's just a little tiny bit of water in a divot in the ground. And you know that if you make too much of a fuss, then you're going to destroy even that. But if you're really careful, you can appreciate that little bit of water without making a mess out of things. So getting down on all fours and drinking like a cow, so slurping up the water directly with your mouth. So in the same way, we really make an effort to look for those moments of clarity and serenity in the person's mind, those moments of openness where they're open to other perspectives or other people's experience. Then the fourth case says, venerables, in the case of a person who is not completely pure in their physical or verbal conduct, and who does not occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind, how should one remove one's resentment towards that person? So this is a person who's a complete mess. And we've probably all met people like this in our life. In fact, we've probably met many, many people like this in our lives. They just don't get it. They don't get this whole kindness and compassion thing. They don't get this whole serenity and wisdom thing. And they're just not remotely interested. They're just completely fixated on themselves and their own self-centered pursuits. And they're not remotely interested in anything else. And what do you do with a person like that? Well, Sariputta gives another simile. He says, venerables, it is like a person who is sick, in pain, and severely ill while traveling on a highway. The village behind them is far away, and the village in front of them is also far away. They do not have access to supportive food, supportive medicine, a proper attendant, or a village leader. Then they are seen by another person who is traveling on that highway. That person produces compassion, empathy, and sympathy for them, thinking, may they gain access to supportive food, supportive medicine, a proper attendant, or a village leader, so that this person does not fall into tragedy and disaster. In the same way, venerables, when a person is not completely pure in physical or verbal conduct, and does not occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind, then one should produce compassion, empathy, and sympathy for them, thinking, may this venerable abandon physical misconduct and develop good physical conduct. May they abandon verbal misconduct and develop good verbal conduct. May they abandon mental misconduct and develop good mental conduct, so that when this venerable is separated from their body after death, they will not reappear in deprivation, a bad destination, downfall in hell. This is how one should remove resentment towards that person. So Sariputta is saying, when you meet someone like that, you should see them as though they are terribly sick. Terribly sick and in a situation where no one can help them. And they have no way to help themselves. So they have no medicine and they have no one to look after them. And there's nothing anywhere close by to them, which is going to help them in either way. So in that situation, what do? You don't hate someone for being sick, but you rouse compassion and wish for them to get better, wish for them to get circumstances which will help them. But there's also a recognition that we might not be able to do it ourselves. We might not be the ones who can help that person. There might not be anything we can do, in fact. And in fact, in other suttas, the Buddha says that sometimes in those situations, you just have to walk away. You should develop equanimity from a distance. If being around a person is destructive to you and no benefit to them, then don't waste your time. So in this case, though, again, we produce compassion, recognizing this person is severely sick in body, speech, and mind, terribly ill, badly diseased, and currently they don't know how to help themselves, and they're not looking for somebody else to help them. So in a really bad spot. So may they get better. May they learn how to take care of themselves. May they learn how to find others who will look after them. May they learn how to get healthy. So this is the proper attitude to have towards that kind of person, the kind of person who seems to just be a complete disaster in every way. Then the fifth case, this is the easy one. Venerables, in the case of a person who is completely pure in physical and verbal conduct and who occasionally gains openness of mind and clarity of mind, how should one remove one's resentment towards that person? Venerables, it is like a pond with clear, pleasant, and cool water, transparent with a pleasant shoreline, charming, shaded by many trees. A person might come who is overheated, overcome by the heat, exhausted, thirsty, and dehydrated. They would plunge into that pond, bathe in it, drink from it, then emerge from it and sit or recline in the shade of a tree. In the same way, venerables, when a person is completely pure in their physical and verbal conduct and occasionally gains openness of mind and clarity of mind, then one should pay attention to their complete purity in physical conduct, their complete purity in verbal conduct, and to the fact that they occasionally gain openness of mind and clarity of mind. This is how one should remove resentment towards that person. Venerables, when the mind is directed towards a person who is so completely inspiring, it becomes inspired. So this final case is the case of somebody who they're doing great. Their speech is kind and gentle and beneficial. They actively do good things with their body. And you can tell that they're really making progress in working with their mind. I find it notable, it doesn't say they always have openness and clarity of mind. It still says occasionally. The Pali word is kalena kalang, which literally means from time to time. So that they don't necessarily always have a perfectly clear and wise and peaceful mind, but from time to time they do. So you can tell that this person is, their physical and verbal conduct are great, and they're making a lot of progress with their mind as well. So this is the kind of person who you just delight in completely. So I get this image of, again, like the exhausted, dehydrated person just like diving into the pond and just frolicking and enjoying it so much. And feeling so refreshed by the cool, clean water. So in the same way, we delight in the presence of a person with so many good qualities. We bathe in those good qualities. We appreciate those good qualities. And we use it as inspiration to cultivate those same good qualities in ourselves. And I find it interesting also that Venerable Sariputta also brings up the possibility that there might still be resentment towards such a person. And if that's the case, it's good to ask ourselves why. Why are we experiencing resentment towards a person who is so inspiring? Is it because they're not fully enlightened yet? Well, most people aren't. But let's pay attention to all their other good qualities. Or maybe we're experiencing envy or jealousy. Well, that's understandable. At least it's envy for something good, something wholesome, something praiseworthy. But the envy is unnecessary. Instead, we can practice mudita. So joy at the goodness of others, joy at the blessings that others experience. What is this resentment? Sometimes the resentment is because we ourselves are so immersed in suffering that when we see somebody else who's not so immersed in suffering, we get irritated. But the irritation is arising from our own dukkha. It's arising from our own sense of frustration and helplessness, our own feeling that our own dukkha is too difficult to overcome. So when we see somebody else who seems to have accomplished something which we feel unable to, then that can be quite irritating. But instead, we can use it as an opportunity for inspiration. Like, oh, wait a minute. If they can do it, so can I. I am not so different from them. Now, remember that every single one of us has the capacity to become fully enlightened, completely pure, completely wise. Every single one of us has the opportunity to develop limitless wisdom and insight, to develop boundless compassion, all-encompassing compassion. So when we encounter someone who's farther along the path than us, then we rejoice in the opportunity to be around somebody who inspires us to practice with more diligence and to make more progress along the path. So that's the end of this sutta. I don't have anything else to say, so we'll go ahead and take whatever questions there are. So let's see, I see a few questions. So hello, Elaine, Melody, Musin, Suzanne, Patricia, Monk Life, John, and Gita. So let's see. Musin has several questions. So it's a little off topic, but I'll give some quick answers. So Musin says, in the Gatikara Sutta, sutta named about the Padar Gatikar, who is the supporter of Buddha Kassapa. In that sutta, the Buddha Gautama mentioned about a town called Vebalinga, and the Buddha Kassapa was once living in that area. My question is, did the Buddha mean that place was in India or a similar place in another world? So there are countless worlds and countless universes. So when the Buddha talks about things happening in other times and places, don't get so caught up in thinking he's just talking about this world, this planet, even this universe. Because the Buddha doesn't have such a narrow perspective. The Buddha has an infinitely broad perspective on things. Then it says, if we have to believe that the Bodhisattva before his last birth was born as a Deva and Tusita lifespan, they say, is millions of years. How could the story refer to this very earth, which the civilization was only started thousands of years before, according to scientists? So once again, don't take such a narrow perspective on things. That's not helpful. Also, we don't know how long the Bodhisattva was in Tusita heaven. As for when Buddha Kassapa was, it's actually not impossible that there I mean, humans have been on this planet for how long? Millions of years? 80 million years?
No.
8 million years? Couple million years? Well, still, a couple of million years is a really long time. So when you talk about civilization, I think what you were referring to is what we would call agricultural civilization. And yeah, I mean, records of that only go back a few thousand years. That's true. But that's not the only form of civilization. And that's certainly not the only way that humans have lived or ever have lived. So were there previous Buddhas prior to modern agricultural civilization? By modern here, I mean the last 5,000 years or so. Oh, it's quite possible. It's quite possible. They would have lived a more primitive life, but that doesn't affect one's abilities to develop spiritual capacities. So I actually don't have any problem whatsoever with caveman Paleolithic Buddha talking to other caveman Paleolithic monks about the path to enlightenment. I don't see any problem with that at all, in fact. Second, Musin asks, why did the Buddha never mention brain as one of the 32 body parts? So first off, it's 31, since brain would be number 32. The commentaries added in brain as a 32nd one. But actually, I take it as fitting under flesh, personally. But also the list of the body parts, I don't interpret as meant to be an exhaustive list of everything in the body, but rather it's a example of how one can pay attention to specific parts or regions or aspects of the body. So the Buddha is not trying to give a complete anatomical description of the body, but rather he's giving a list of several particular aspects of the body which one can use as a way of developing a more complete, detailed, three-dimensional mindfulness of one's own body. So it's about cultivating a direct physical experience of one's body. Then finally he says, how did the monks at the time of the Buddha shave and brush their teeth when they did not possess razors or toothbrushes? What do you mean they didn't possess razors? A razor is just a sharp piece of metal. People have had sharp pieces of metal for tens of thousands of years. It's not a terribly difficult thing to have a sharp piece of metal. As for toothbrushes, that's spoken about. They used tooth cleaning sticks, which there is particular kinds of wood which have antimicrobial properties, and those were commonly used. Actually, to this day, they're still used in parts of the world. So those were used as a way of cleaning one's teeth. See, other questions? So Tran says, this sutta is so relevant to current events with all the riots stemming from political differences. It is very easy to blame and demonize people for their unwise actions and violence, but very hard to offer compassion and sympathy. What would you suggest to heal our nation? Well, I don't have any recommendations for healing our nation, but I have some recommendations for healing our own minds. So one of the things I find really helpful when reflecting on the unwise or unwholesome actions of any person is that those unwise actions are arising from their own dukkha. It's simply that person acting out their own suffering. They're just displaying their own defilements. They're displaying their own misery. They're displaying their own confusion. That's really sad. It's kind of like when somebody is really sick and in a lot of pain, then sometimes they thrash around. And in that thrashing around, they might hurt the nurse who's looking after them. or they might injure themselves, or they might break things. But that's just them thrashing around because of their extreme suffering. So it's the same. When somebody's mind is filled with delusions and defilements, then they thrash around. And sometimes that thrashing around involves really unwholesome things, such as attacking Congress, for example. Not particularly wholesome course of action. So in those cases, yeah, have compassion for these people, because these people, they are so overcome with delusion and defilement that they think that unwholesome actions are good. And they have no idea what wholesome actions are. That's really sad. That's like the case of the fourth kind of person in the sutta. Someone who, they're really sick and there's nobody, they don't know how to take care of themselves, and there's nobody to help them out. And you're just like, wow, I hope that person gets help sooner or later, because they're going in a bad direction fast. But nonetheless, it should be pointed out, you don't necessarily need to write things off as political differences. If somebody is upholding an immoral stance, it's still an immoral stance, no matter how much they try to say, oh, it's just politics. Oh, it's just my political stance. If it's immoral, it's immoral. If it's unwholesome, it's unwholesome. So you can't hide behind political parties in order to justify immoral standpoints on things. So, yeah, people, they use all kinds of excuses to justify their own misconduct, but we don't need to buy into that. So a lot of the problems that we've seen over the last few years were not about political differences. They were about a lack of morality, a lack of compassion. That fundamentally is the problem. Okay. Then next. Rusan says, I mean, does razor or a piece of metal belong to one of the monks' requisites at that time? Yeah, it's mentioned in the Vinaya. This was it was only 2,500 years ago. Do some research on the development of technology. Humans figured out how to make sharp pieces of metal a really, really long time ago. It was not difficult. One of the early developments was copper tools. So copper is very, very easy metal to shape because it's quite soft in its natural form. You don't need to heat it. You just need to pound it into shape. So, oh gosh, look it up online. You can find out. Humans have known how to make sharp pieces of metal for thousands and thousands of years. 2,500 years ago was not a long time. Not a long time ago. Okay, another question. Epicenter Wellness says, even if we practice as instructed, still a shred of hatred might persist within us when encountering one of these types of people. How to handle that internal hatred that might persist? Well, of course, until you're very far along the path, you're still going to have some degree of hatred and aversion, some degree of hostility and negativity. So you just keep chipping away at it, keep rubbing it away, and it gets weaker and weaker and less, and eventually it dissipates entirely. So keep directing attention towards serenity of mind, appreciating the soothing pleasantness of a peaceful mind. And when you do notice any degree of aversion in the mind, notice how unpleasant and uncomfortable it is. And try to let it relax and subside, and notice how much nicer that feels. And over time, if you practice in this way, over time, the aversion gets weaker and weaker. Okay, so that's the end of the questions. So there's a number of comments which I quite appreciated. So Michael and Suzanne both had some lovely comments. So thank you for your lovely comments. Musin says, monks only allowed to have 4 requisites, right? No, that's totally wrong. No, totally wrong. Monks can have lots of things. And that's at the end of the question. So thank you all for joining in. And please join us again tomorrow at the same time and Friday. So every morning at 8 a.m. for sutta study. And this evening and the next 2 evenings at 7:30 for meditation and a Dhamma talk. So we'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And see you next time.